Sometimes the most expensive mistake isn't made with a weapon or a lawsuit. Sometimes it begins with a single assumption. 48 hours after a routine arrest at a quiet bus stop, the city of Atlanta would approve one of the largest civil rights settlements in its recent history. For $0.7 million. Headlines would call it a failure of judgment. Attorneys would call it a violation of constitutional rights. Community leaders would call it another painful reminder that appearances can still outweigh truth. But for the people who stood at that bus stop on that cool Tuesday morning, none of that had happened yet. They only saw an ordinary woman standing beneath a faded blue transit shelter, holding a leather briefcase in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. Danielle Carter blended naturally into the rhythm of the city. She wore a charcoal business suit beneath a light camel coat, comfortable walking shoes instead of heels, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years earning every opportunity she had ever received. She checked the arrival time on her phone before slipping it back into her pocket, taking a slow sip of coffee as buses rolled through downtown traffic. Around her, life continued with familiar precision. A construction crew laughed across the street while preparing for another workday. A retired veteran read the morning newspaper on the bench closest to the shelter. A young mother gently reminded her son to keep his backpack zipped before school. The scent of fresh pastries drifted from a nearby bakery, mixing with the crisp autumn air as the first rays of sunlight reflected against the windows of nearby office towers. It looked like any other morning in America. Yet hidden inside that ordinary moment was a decision that would soon alter multiple lives forever. Danielle wasn't in a hurry. She preferred public transportation whenever her schedule allowed. It gave her time to think before long meetings and reminded her that the law existed to serve every citizen, not only those who could afford private drivers or reserved parking spaces. Few people recognized her face, and she preferred it that way. Respect, she believed, should never depend on titles announced before introductions. A city bus rounded the corner several blocks away, its digital sign glowing through the morning light. Danielle glanced toward it and smiled faintly. Right on schedule. Then another vehicle entered the intersection. A marked police cruiser slowed as it approached the bus stop. At first, no one paid much attention. Patrol cars were common downtown. Officer Ethan Brooks had spent nearly 12 years wearing the badge. He believed experience had sharpened his instincts. That morning, however, fatigue, assumptions, and overconfidence quietly blurred the line between observation and conclusion. His eyes settled on Danielle for only a few seconds before he eased the cruiser toward the curb. The veteran lowered his newspaper. The construction workers briefly paused their conversation. The young mother instinctively held her son's shoulder a little closer. Small moments like these often passed without consequence. This one would not. Ethan stepped from the cruiser with measured confidence, adjusting the radio clip to his uniform before walking directly toward Danielle. She met his eyes with calm professionalism, offering the polite expression one stranger usually gives another. Neither of them knew that cameras were already watching. A city traffic camera overlooked the intersection. A transit security camera faced the shelter. Several nearby businesses maintained exterior surveillance 24 hours a day. More importantly, a college student waiting across the street had just begun recording the morning skyline for a photography project, unknowingly capturing everything that was about to unfold. Danielle remained perfectly still as Officer Brooks stopped a few feet away. She neither looked nervous nor offended. She simply waited. Around them, conversations faded into silence. Engines hummed. A bus approached in the distance. And somewhere beyond the noise of the waking city, destiny quietly took its first irreversible step. Officer Ethan Brooks stopped just outside Danielle Carter's personal space, his polished badge catching the morning sunlight as he studied her with an expression that revealed confidence more than curiosity. "Good morning, ma'am," he said in a firm, controlled voice. "May I see some identification?" Danielle looked at him calmly, never allowing surprise or frustration to reach her face. She had spent years inside courtrooms where emotions often clouded judgment, and she had learned that composure was sometimes the strongest response. "Certainly, officer," she replied with quiet courtesy as she reached slowly into her coat pocket and produced her driver's license along with a federal identification wallet. She held both carefully so they remained visible before extending them toward him. Ethan accepted the documents, but barely glanced at the federal credentials before focusing on her driver's license. His eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the interaction did not match the conclusion he had already begun forming in his own mind. Around them, the people waiting for the bus remained unusually silent. The retired veteran folded his newspaper completely now, sensing that an ordinary conversation had somehow become heavier. The young mother looked away for a brief moment before checking again, uncertain whether she should continue watching. The construction workers across the street exchanged puzzled looks, but returned to loading equipment, assuming the encounter would end within seconds. Danielle remained perfectly still, her briefcase resting beside her polished shoes. She understood that respectful cooperation often resolved misunderstandings quickly. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked in an even tone. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked from the identification back to Danielle several times, as though searching for confirmation of an assumption that refused to fit the facts in front of him. "Where are you headed this morning?" he finally asked. "Downtown," Danielle answered. "I have an 8:30 meeting." "Where exactly?" Ethan continued. "Federal offices," she replied without hesitation. "Business meeting." His posture stiffened. Instead of reducing the tension, each calm answer appeared to deepen his uncertainty. Danielle noticed the subtle change, but chose not to comment. She believed every encounter with law enforcement deserved mutual respect, even when the questions felt unnecessary. Another city bus rolled past without stopping, its brakes releasing a long burst of compressed air before disappearing around the corner. The opportunity to leave quietly had already slipped away. A man wearing headphones removed one earbud, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Across the intersection, the college student continued recording the skyline, unaware that his camera remained pointed directly toward the bus shelter. Ethan opened the identification wallet again. This time his eyes lingered on the federal seal before quickly closing it. "Can you explain why you are carrying this credential?" he asked. Danielle blinked once, surprised less by the question itself than by the uncertainty behind it. "Because it belongs to me," she answered politely. "It identifies my position." Ethan looked unconvinced. "People carry fake credentials all the time." Danielle nodded slowly, refusing to let impatience enter her voice. "If you believe verification is necessary, there are established procedures available to you." The sentence was simple, respectful, and entirely factual. Yet somehow it only made the silence around them grow heavier. Ethan shifted his weight and rested one hand near his duty belt, not in a threatening manner, but in the practiced posture of someone asserting authority. Danielle noticed several pedestrians slowing their pace while pretending not to watch. Public attention changes the atmosphere of every encounter. She understood that better than most. Embarrassment spreads quickly, even before anyone knows the truth. She glanced briefly toward the approaching bus schedule displayed on the digital sign. 2 more minutes. Her meeting would soon begin without her if the conversation continued much longer. Still, she made no attempt to leave. Running late could be explained. Escalating a peaceful interaction never should be. Ethan inhaled slowly before speaking again. "I need you to remain here while I verify this information." Danielle offered a small nod. "Of course. I have nowhere else to be until this is resolved." Her answer carried neither sarcasm nor resistance. It reflected simple confidence that facts eventually speak louder than assumptions. Neither of them realized that every passing second was adding another layer to a public record that would later be examined frame by frame, word by word, and silence by silence, transforming what appeared to be an ordinary delay at a neighborhood bus stop into evidence that would eventually be seen across an entire nation. Danielle Carter stood with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through countless courtrooms, congressional briefings, and difficult conversations where patience often accomplished more than volume ever could. She understood that every public interaction carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. A careless word could become tomorrow's headline. An unnecessary argument could distract from the truth. So she waited, allowing Officer Ethan Brooks the time he believed he needed, trusting that facts would eventually reach the same destination regardless of how slowly they traveled. Ethan stepped a few feet away and spoke into his shoulder radio in a measured voice, requesting assistance with credential verification. His words were professional, but the hesitation behind them revealed uncertainty. The dispatcher acknowledged the request, and asked him to remain on scene while additional information was checked through official channels. Danielle heard every word without reacting. She simply adjusted the handle of her briefcase and looked toward the intersection where another traffic light changed from red to green. Morning commuters continued filling the sidewalks, though many now slowed their pace as curiosity quietly replaced routine. A delivery driver paused while unloading boxes outside a nearby pharmacy. Two office employees whispered to one another while pretending to study their phones. The college student across the street lowered his camera for a moment before raising it again, sensing that whatever was unfolding had become more significant than a simple city landscape. None of them knew who Danielle really was. They only saw a composed black woman surrounded by growing attention and a police officer who seemed increasingly convinced that something was wrong despite finding no evidence to support that belief. Danielle had experienced similar moments before, though never exactly like this. Throughout her legal career, she had represented the principle that every individual deserved equal protection under the law, regardless of profession, neighborhood, appearance, or income. She believed deeply that respect for constitutional rights strengthened law enforcement rather than weakened it. Good officers depended on public trust. Communities depended on accountability. The two ideas were never supposed to compete. Ethan returned after finishing his radio transmission. "I still need additional confirmation," he said. Danielle nodded politely. "I understand. Do you have any other identification?" he asked. Without hesitation, she opened her briefcase slowly, making every movement deliberate so there could be no misunderstanding. Inside were neatly organized legal folders, a laptop computer, a notebook filled with handwritten case notes, and a professional planner marked with appointments scheduled weeks in advance. She carefully removed another government identification card and handed it to him. Ethan examined it longer this time, but instead of reducing his concern, the additional credentials seemed to deepen it. The federal seals, official formatting, and professional appearance somehow conflicted with the conclusion he had already reached in his own mind. Confirmation bias quietly narrowed his judgment. Instead of allowing new information to reshape his thinking, he searched for reasons to doubt information that challenged his first impression. Danielle recognized the subtle shift almost immediately. Years of interviewing witnesses had taught her how people behaved when they stopped gathering facts and started defending assumptions. She remained completely composed. "Officer," she said gently, "if there is a supervisor available, I would welcome the opportunity to clarify anything that concerns you." Her suggestion carried no accusation. It was practical, respectful, and designed to resolve the situation peacefully. Ethan hesitated before answering. "We are not there yet." Around them, the silence became almost tangible. Even passing traffic seemed quieter between changing lights. The retired veteran slowly stood from the bench, uncertain whether he should continue waiting for his bus or remain to witness what intuition told him might become important. The young mother looked down at her son and quietly reminded him that every person deserved to be treated fairly, words spoken softly enough that only he could hear them. Danielle noticed the child looking toward her with innocent confusion, and she offered him a reassuring smile. The simple gesture contrasted sharply with the growing tension surrounding the encounter. A notification sounded from inside Danielle's planner reminding her of the meeting she was now certain she would miss. She silenced it without frustration. Deadlines could be rescheduled. Integrity could not. Moments later, another patrol vehicle appeared at the far end of the street, moving steadily toward the bus stop as the morning crowd instinctively shifted backward to create space. The arrival of a second officer transformed quiet curiosity into unmistakable public attention, and without realizing it, everyone present had just stepped one moment closer to an event that would soon force an entire city to confront the difference between suspicion and evidence, between authority and judgment, and between the appearance of justice and justice itself. The second patrol vehicle came to a smooth stop behind Officer Ethan Brooks's cruiser, its flashing emergency lights remaining off as another uniformed officer stepped onto the sidewalk. Officer Melissa Grant looked from Ethan to Danielle, then briefly scanned the growing number of people gathered near the bus shelter. She could immediately sense that something unusual had delayed what should have been a routine interaction. "What do we have?" she asked quietly. Ethan handed her the identification wallet without saying much more than, "The credentials do not add up." Melissa opened the wallet, carefully examining the federal seal before looking back at Danielle. "Good morning, ma'am," she said professionally. Danielle returned the greeting with the same calm expression she had maintained since the first question had been asked. "Good morning, officer." Melissa studied her for a moment before handing the credentials back to Ethan. "Dispatch is still checking," Ethan explained. "Until then, I need to keep control of the situation." Danielle remained composed. "Officer Brooks, I have fully cooperated with every request you have made. I have answered your questions, provided multiple forms of identification, and remained exactly where you asked me to stand." Her voice carried neither anger nor fear. It was simply factual. Ethan nodded once, but did not relax. Instead, he looked toward the crowd that had quietly doubled in size over the past several minutes. More commuters had arrived expecting an ordinary bus ride to work, only to discover an encounter that had captured everyone's attention. Several people discreetly held their phones at chest level. Some were checking messages. Others had quietly begun recording. The retired veteran folded his newspaper beneath one arm and watched with increasing concern. The college student across the street continued filming almost absent-mindedly, believing he was documenting another ordinary day in downtown Atlanta. Danielle noticed the growing audience and understood exactly what public misunderstanding could do to someone's reputation. She had represented clients whose names were judged long before evidence was ever examined. She refused to become another person defined by assumptions made during a few incomplete moments. "Officer," she said gently, "would you please tell me what specific concern has caused this delay?" Ethan hesitated. He realized he could not point to a crime, a complaint, or any witness reporting unlawful conduct. His uncertainty had quietly transformed into determination. "Your identification requires additional verification," he replied. "Until that process is complete, I need you to remain here." Danielle nodded once more. "I have remained here voluntarily since you first asked." Ethan looked around again before making a decision that instantly changed the atmosphere. "At this point," he said, "I am placing you in temporary detention until verification is complete." A wave of quiet surprise moved through the crowd. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. Instead, conversation stopped entirely. Even the construction crew across the street lowered their equipment to watch. Danielle's eyes remained steady. She neither stepped backward nor raised her voice. "Officer Brooks," she replied calmly, "I respectfully disagree with that decision. However, I will continue cooperating peacefully." Melissa glanced toward Ethan, her expression revealing uncertainty. "Dispatch should not be much longer," she said softly enough that only he could hear. Ethan answered without taking his eyes off Danielle. "I am not taking chances." Danielle slowly placed her coffee cup on the empty bench beside her briefcase. She carefully smoothed the sleeve of her coat before bringing her hands together in front of her body without being instructed to do so. The gesture reflected remarkable composure rather than surrender. She understood that dignity often spoke loudest when emotions remained silent. A city bus finally arrived at the curb, its doors opening with a familiar hiss before the driver noticed the officers and quietly waited. Passengers inside looked through the windows, trying to understand why no one was boarding. Time itself seemed to pause beneath the gray shelter roof. Danielle looked directly at Ethan with the same composed expression she had worn since the beginning of the encounter. "Officer Brooks," she said in a calm, measured voice, "every public servant carries responsibility for the choices made while wearing that title. I sincerely hope today's decisions are based on facts rather than assumptions." Ethan offered no response. Instead, he instructed her to accompany him toward the patrol vehicle while Melissa remained nearby observing the interaction. Danielle complied without resistance, walking at a normal pace as dozens of silent eyes followed every step. No one present realized that the surveillance cameras above them, the phones held quietly among the crowd, and the patient professionalism of the woman now being escorted across the sidewalk were preserving a record that would later become impossible to ignore, turning one ordinary morning into a defining lesson about the lasting cost of decisions made before the truth is fully understood. Danielle Carter walked beside Officer Ethan Brooks with steady, measured steps, her posture unchanged despite the dozens of curious eyes following every movement. She neither hurried nor hesitated. She simply accepted each moment as it came, believing that dignity was never determined by circumstances, but by the choices a person made within them. The patrol vehicle waited only a few yards away, reflecting the bright morning sun across its windshield while commuters continued gathering near the bus stop in confused silence. The city bus remained parked with its doors open as passengers looked through the windows, wondering why no one was boarding. Some quietly checked the time on their watches. Others continued recording with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something they could not fully explain. Officer Melissa Grant stayed a short distance behind Ethan, her expression thoughtful as she listened to the steady stream of radio traffic coming through her shoulder microphone. Dispatch still had not completed the credential verification. The delay felt unusually long. Danielle stopped beside the rear passenger door of the patrol vehicle exactly where Ethan indicated. She calmly folded her hands together in front of her coat and waited without complaint. "Do you understand why you are being temporarily detained?" Ethan asked. Danielle looked directly at him before answering. "I understand the words you are using, officer. I do not understand the facts supporting them." Her response was respectful, quiet, and impossible to mistake for defiance. Ethan paused for a brief moment before looking away. He had expected frustration. Instead, he found calm reasoning, and somehow that made the situation even more uncomfortable. Melissa watched the exchange carefully. She had worked enough years in uniform to recognize the difference between someone creating conflict and someone trying to avoid it. Danielle had done everything requested since the encounter began. She had answered every question, produced every document, remained exactly where instructed, and spoken with consistent professionalism. Yet the situation continued moving in only one direction. The retired veteran finally stepped closer, remaining well outside the officer's working space. "Officer," he asked politely, "is there anything this lady has done that the rest of us missed?" Ethan acknowledged the question without answering it directly. "Sir, I need everyone to remain back while we complete our investigation." The veteran nodded respectfully and returned to the sidewalk, but the question lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. They had witnessed the entire interaction from the beginning, and many struggled to identify the moment where cooperation had somehow become suspicion. Danielle noticed none of the growing whispers. Instead, she looked toward the skyline beyond the intersection where sunlight reflected from the glass towers of the federal district. Somewhere inside one of those buildings, colleagues were likely wondering why she had not yet arrived. Her calendar was carefully planned, her responsibilities significant, but none of that occupied her thoughts now. She thought instead about trust. Public trust took years to build and only moments to weaken. Every unnecessary misunderstanding between citizens and law enforcement carried consequences far beyond those immediately involved. Ethan's radio suddenly crackled to life. Both officers instinctively looked down. "Unit 12, the dispatcher announced. Verification is still pending. Federal contact has requested additional time. Stand by for confirmation." Ethan acknowledged the transmission with a brief reply. Danielle quietly listened without interrupting. A faint breeze swept through the bus shelter, scattering a few dry autumn leaves across the sidewalk. The college student across the street lowered his camera for the first time since the encounter began. His battery indicator flashed red. Before slipping the device into his backpack, he looked at the screen and realized the recording had captured nearly every minute from Ethan's first approach until now. He saved the file without thinking much about it. It simply felt important not to lose it. Danielle slowly turned back toward Ethan. "Officer Brooks," she said with genuine sincerity, "I hope, when this is over, everyone involved can leave with greater understanding than they arrived with." Ethan studied her expression, perhaps expecting sarcasm, but finding none. She sounded as though she honestly believed those words. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crossed his face. Decisions made confidently only minutes earlier no longer felt quite as certain. Yet pride often speaks louder than doubt, especially when an audience is watching. Around them, another wave of commuters arrived at the stop, immediately noticing the unusual silence surrounding the patrol car. More witnesses unknowingly joined the growing circle, while unseen security cameras continued recording every second without emotion or opinion. Somewhere beyond the city streets, phone calls were beginning to reach offices where names, credentials, and official records could soon answer every unanswered question. The truth was already moving toward the bus stop. It simply had not arrived yet. The answer finally arrived, not with raised voices or dramatic confrontation, but with the calm electronic tone of a police radio. Officer Ethan Brooks glanced toward the speaker clipped to his shoulder as dispatch called his unit once again. This time the voice carried a different cadence, slower and unmistakably more deliberate. Unit 12, Federal Credential Verification has been completed. Please stand by for additional information from the requesting agency. Ethan's expression remained controlled, but Melissa Grant immediately noticed the subtle change in his posture. She had heard enough dispatch calls throughout her career to recognize when a routine inquiry had become something far more significant. Danielle Carter stood exactly where she had been asked to remain, her hands relaxed, her expression composed, never allowing the growing uncertainty around her to affect her own. She had long ago accepted that truth often moved more slowly than assumptions, but it almost always arrived eventually. The crowd sensed the shift before anyone spoke another word. Conversations faded again as every nearby pedestrian instinctively watched the officers. Even the bus driver, who had waited far longer than his schedule allowed, remained parked at the curb after quietly notifying transit control that an unexpected police investigation had delayed boarding. Across the street, employees inside a neighborhood coffee shop pressed gently against the front window, trying to understand what had brought an entire city block to such complete silence. Ethan acknowledged dispatch and waited. Only a few seconds passed before the radio activated again. Unit 12, federal officials have confirmed the credentials are authentic. The individual has been positively identified as Danielle Carter, United States Attorney. Additional supervisory personnel from the federal office have requested direct communication with the scene. The words seemed to suspend time itself. Melissa slowly turned toward Danielle, her eyes widening almost imperceptibly. The retired veteran lowered his head for a brief moment, as though everything he had quietly suspected had now been confirmed. Several people holding phones exchanged astonished glances without saying a word. Ethan remained perfectly still. For the first time that morning, certainty disappeared completely from his face. Danielle did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded once, almost as though the confirmation changed nothing about who she already knew herself to be. Ethan lowered the radio from his shoulder and looked directly at her. The silence between them felt heavier than every conversation they had shared since the encounter began. Finally he spoke. "Ms. Carter." His voice lacked the confidence it had carried only minutes earlier. Danielle answered with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the morning. "Yes, officer." Ethan searched for words that refused to come easily. "It appears your identification has been verified." Danielle offered a small, understanding nod. "I believed it would be." There was no satisfaction in her voice, no trace of resentment, only quiet certainty. Melissa took one careful step forward. "Ma'am, I believe we should contact a supervisor immediately." Danielle looked toward her with genuine kindness. "I believe that would be appropriate." Before anyone moved, another vehicle approached the intersection. It was not marked as a patrol car. A dark government sedan rolled smoothly to the curb several yards away. Two professionally dressed federal employees stepped onto the sidewalk, each carrying identification openly in plain view. They walked calmly toward the group without urgency, their measured pace reflecting confidence rather than alarm. One of them addressed Danielle first. "Good morning, Counselor Carter. We have been trying to reach the responding officers." Danielle acknowledged them with a polite smile before introducing them to the officers standing beside her. Neither federal official displayed anger or accusation. Their professionalism matched Danielle's exactly, making the contrast with the morning's misunderstanding even more striking. One of the officials quietly confirmed Danielle's position, responsibilities, and scheduled meeting that morning before requesting the names and badge numbers of every responding officer for administrative documentation. Ethan provided the information without hesitation. Melissa did the same. Around them, the crowd slowly began dispersing, though many continued looking back as they walked away. Some ended their recordings. Others simply shook their heads before continuing toward work. The college student who had unknowingly documented nearly the entire encounter looked down at his camera one more time before carefully placing it inside his backpack. He still had no idea how valuable those recordings would soon become. Danielle picked up her briefcase from the bench where she had left it nearly an hour earlier. Her coffee had long since grown cold, but her composure remained unchanged. She looked once more at Officer Ethan Brooks before speaking softly enough that only those standing nearby could hear. Every badge represents public trust. Every citizen deserves that trust to be guided by facts. No one answered immediately because there was nothing left to argue. The truth had finally reached the bus stop, and with it came a silence far more powerful than any accusation ever could be. By the following afternoon, the quiet encounter at the downtown bus stop had transformed into something far larger than anyone standing there could have imagined. What began as a delayed commute had become the subject of internal reports, legal briefings, and urgent meetings inside both the Atlanta Police Department and the United States Attorney's Office. The first questions were no longer about Danielle Carter's identity. Those had been answered beyond dispute. The questions now focused on decisions, procedures, and whether every step taken that morning had been supported by objective facts rather than assumptions. Danielle returned to work with the same professionalism that had defined her entire career. She did not call a press conference. She did not post comments online. She did not seek public sympathy. Instead, she documented every detail while the memories remained fresh, noting the exact sequence of events, the questions asked, the responses given, the arrival times of each officer, and the names of the witnesses who had voluntarily approached federal investigators later that day. She understood that facts carried far greater weight than emotion, especially inside a courtroom. Meanwhile, investigators began gathering every available piece of evidence. The city traffic camera preserved the interaction from the moment Officer Ethan Brooks first stopped his patrol vehicle. The transit authority provided security footage from multiple angles around the shelter. Nearby businesses voluntarily submitted exterior surveillance recordings showing the entire sidewalk throughout the encounter. Then the college student contacted investigators after learning that his camera had unintentionally captured nearly every conversation from across the intersection. His recording filled several gaps that none of the fixed cameras could see. Even the body-worn cameras assigned to both responding officers became part of the official review. One by one, every recording told the same story. Danielle had remained calm. She had answered every question. She had provided multiple forms of authentic identification. She had made no threatening movements, offered no resistance, and repeatedly suggested peaceful ways to verify her credentials. The evidence did not contradict itself. Instead, each new recording reinforced the one before it. Supervisors reviewing the material noticed something else as well. At several points, opportunities existed to pause, reassess, or verify information through less restrictive means before the encounter escalated further. Those moments became the focus of lengthy administrative discussions. Officer Ethan Brooks watched portions of the recordings during his initial interview with internal investigators. Seeing the encounter from outside his own perspective felt very different from living through it in real time. Decisions that had once seemed obvious now appeared incomplete when viewed alongside every available camera angle and every recorded conversation. Officer Melissa Grant also provided a detailed statement describing exactly what she had observed after arriving at the scene. Her account matched both the recordings and Danielle's timeline with remarkable consistency. Days later, attorneys representing the city met with outside legal advisors to evaluate potential liability. Their analysis extended far beyond one officer or one morning. They examined department policies, training standards, supervisory procedures, documentation requirements, and constitutional obligations. The discussion was no longer limited to a single encounter at a bus stop. It had become a broader examination of institutional responsibility. Danielle participated only when formally requested, answering every question with the same measured professionalism she had shown on the sidewalk. She avoided exaggeration because she knew the truth required none. The recordings already spoke clearly enough. Reporters soon learned that multiple investigations were underway, but Danielle declined repeated interview requests. One simple statement through her office became her only public comment. Public confidence depends upon fairness, accountability, and equal treatment under the law. The sentence appeared in newspapers across Georgia before spreading through national media outlets. It was quoted because of its simplicity rather than its drama. Behind closed conference room doors, city officials gradually recognized the strength of the evidence assembled before them. Every document, every witness statement, every surveillance recording, and every official report pointed toward the same unavoidable conclusion. The case was no longer centered on competing opinions. It rested upon a complete factual record preserved from beginning to end. The truth had not emerged through accusation or emotion. It had emerged because ordinary cameras, ordinary witnesses, and one extraordinary display of patience had quietly preserved every moment exactly as it happened. Weeks turned into months as attorneys, investigators, and city officials examined every page of documentation connected to the encounter. What had once appeared to be an isolated misunderstanding gradually became one of the most carefully reviewed civil rights cases the city had faced in years. Conference rooms replaced sidewalks. Legal briefs replaced radio transmissions. Every decision made that morning was measured against department policy, constitutional standards, and the evidence preserved by cameras that never forgot a single second. Danielle Carter approached the legal process with the same discipline she had demonstrated from the very beginning. She never exaggerated what had happened because she did not need to. Every fact had already been documented. Every conversation had been recorded. Every timeline had been independently verified. During sworn testimony, she answered each question carefully, allowing the evidence to remain the center of the case rather than her emotions. She explained how public confidence in the justice system depended upon equal treatment, consistency, and accountability. She reminded everyone involved that constitutional protections existed for every person, regardless of occupation or background. The issue before the city was never about one individual's title. It was about whether identical facts would have produced identical decisions if presented under different circumstances. Attorneys representing the city reviewed the surveillance recordings repeatedly. They compared witness statements with body camera footage, dispatch logs, and radio communications. Every source aligned with remarkable consistency. The retired veteran described Danielle's calm cooperation exactly as the cameras showed it. The young mother's statement matched the timeline established by transit security footage. The college student's recording captured conversations that confirmed the sequence of decisions made by responding officers. Independent evidence continued reinforcing independent evidence until the factual record became impossible to dispute. Officer Ethan Brooks also participated fully in the administrative review. During multiple interviews, he acknowledged that, looking back, there had been opportunities to slow the encounter, verify information through additional channels, and reassess the situation before making decisions that carried greater consequences. Investigators noted his cooperation, but they also concluded that good intentions alone could not erase the constitutional responsibilities attached to public authority. Accountability existed precisely because authority carried extraordinary responsibility. Officer Melissa Grant's testimony reflected professionalism throughout the investigation. She answered every question honestly and confirmed the observations she had made while standing beside Ethan that morning. Her consistency strengthened the credibility of the overall investigation because her account remained unchanged from her very first written report through the final administrative interviews. As the legal proceedings advanced, outside experts examined departmental training, supervision, communication protocols, and field decision-making. Recommendations extended beyond one officer or one incident. The city recognized that meaningful improvement required stronger guidance, additional training, and clearer safeguards designed to reduce the risk of similar situations in the future. Gradually, private settlement discussions began. They were conducted quietly, away from television cameras and public speculation. Lawyers on both sides understood that trials carried uncertainty, but they also understood the extraordinary strength of the documented evidence. Every additional review reached the same conclusion. The factual record overwhelmingly favored Danielle's claims. Eventually, city leaders voted to approve a civil settlement totaling $4.7 million. The announcement immediately attracted national attention, not simply because of the amount involved, but because officials publicly acknowledged the importance of protecting constitutional rights and maintaining public trust. Yet Danielle never described the outcome as a personal victory. During a brief statement after the agreement became public, she chose her words with the same care she had shown throughout the entire process. Justice is not measured by the size of a settlement, she said. Justice is measured by whether institutions are willing to learn, improve, and protect the rights of every person they serve. Her statement spread across newspapers, television broadcasts, and community meetings throughout the country. Many people expected anger. Others expected celebration. Instead, they saw quiet dignity once again. The same woman who had stood patiently beneath a neighborhood bus shelter months earlier now stood before the nation with exactly the same calm voice, proving that true strength did not come from raising one's volume. It came from remaining faithful to the truth until the truth finally spoke loudly enough for everyone else to hear. Several months after the settlement was finalized, the downtown bus stop looked exactly as it always had. City buses continued arriving every morning. Office workers hurried toward another busy day. Parents waited beside students carrying backpacks. The construction crews returned to nearby projects. To most people passing through the intersection, it was simply another ordinary corner in another American city. Very few realized they were standing where one quiet morning had changed policies, careers, and conversations about public trust. A small plaque was never installed. No ceremony marked the location. Yet the lessons learned there continued traveling far beyond the sidewalk itself. Inside the police department, updated training emphasized the importance of objective decision-making, careful verification, and the responsibility every officer carried when exercising public authority. New discussions focused on slowing situations down whenever possible, recognizing that patience often revealed facts that hurried assumptions could easily miss. Supervisors reminded young officers that professionalism was measured not only by decisive action, but also by disciplined judgment. Danielle Carter never sought recognition for what had happened. She returned to the work she believed in, continuing to represent the law with the same integrity she had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. Colleagues occasionally asked whether she regretted remaining so calm that morning. Her answer never changed. She believed that anger might have won attention for a moment, but composure allowed the truth to remain unmistakably clear from beginning to end. The evidence spoke because she never gave it a reason to become distracted by emotion. Officer Ethan Brooks quietly accepted the consequences that followed the investigation. The experience became the defining moment of his career, forcing him to confront difficult questions about judgment, responsibility, and the weight carried by every decision made while wearing a badge. Accountability did not erase the past, but it reminded everyone watching that public service required continuous reflection as much as authority. Melissa Grant continued serving her community with renewed awareness of how quickly ordinary encounters could shape public confidence. She often reminded younger officers that every person they met carried a story they could not see, and that respect should never depend upon assumptions. The retired veteran still rode the same bus route several mornings each week. Sometimes he looked toward the exact place where Danielle had stood with her briefcase and remembered how easily appearances could mislead even experienced observers. The young mother told her son, now a little older, that the most important part of that day was not the settlement that later made headlines. It was watching someone choose dignity when misunderstanding would have made bitterness seem easier. The college student eventually completed his photography project, though one unexpected recording became far more meaningful than any skyline he had planned to capture. His camera had preserved an ordinary moment that ultimately helped extraordinary truth reach the people responsible for making difficult decisions. Imagine standing at that same bus stop without knowing any of this history. You would hear buses arriving, conversations beginning, coffee cups rustling, and footsteps crossing the sidewalk. Nothing would seem remarkable. Yet history often begins exactly that way. Not with dramatic speeches or extraordinary heroes, but with ordinary people making choices when nobody expects those choices to matter. Danielle Carter never needed to announce her title to prove her worth. The truth already knew her name long before anyone else did. And when the facts were finally allowed to speak, they did not ask for revenge. They asked for accountability. They asked for fairness. They asked for a justice system strong enough to correct its own mistakes. In the end, the most powerful lesson was never about the money, the headlines, or the legal victory. It was about something far more enduring. A badge grants authority, but character earns trust. Authority can stop a person for a moment, yet truth continues moving long after the moment has passed. And when dignity refuses to surrender to assumption, justice eventually finds its voice, reminding every generation that the strongest foundation of the law is not power alone, but the courage to treat every human being with equal respect before reaching any conclusion.